The following program is classified M, recommended for viewing by mature audiences 15 years and over.
Murder. Cold-blooded murder. Well, welcome back to By George on this beautiful sunny Johnsonville day. I'm standing at the top of Bannister Avenue here in Johnsonville West. Bannister Avenue is named after the Bannister family. The Bannister family played an important part in the history of Johnsonville. They what we now called Glenside. That was the halfway point between Wellington and Pororura if you were coming by horse and cart or horse and carriage. The Bannister family arrived in Wellington in 1840 on board the ship the Bolton, which is where I guess we get Bolton Street from in town. Mr. William Bannister, his wife Mary, his children Edwin, William Jr., John Eads and Robert Elijah all settled in central Wellington. William Bannister became a publican and established the Lambton Tavern. In 1843 he erected the Crown and Anchor Hotel, and he lived there until 1857. The Crown and Anchor Hotel was an extremely successful hotel. It did very well financially, and it was a very well-used establishment, shall we say. It was also used for various meetings. Some of them were political. They had political meetings there for local council and pre-government sort of stuff as well. So they did very well out of that. But in 1857, William decided to semi-retire to his property up in Johnsonville, which was the Hollies. Behind me you can see where Hollies was. We're not sure exactly when William bought the property. There is some evidence to say he bought it in England off the Wellington Company in 1839. Quite often if you bought land from the New Zealand Company, I think it was, before you came out here, you got 1 and 100 was the deal. So you got 1 acre in town and 100 acres in the countryside. Now, the evidence is very confusing. There's a lot of evidence to say that he didn't do that, but there is also a small amount of evidence to say he did buy it before he came. But we can't say he did because there's a lot of evidence to say he bought land in Wanganui and different places like that. Either way, in 1857 he came up to the Hollies and started farming. They ran cattle and poultry. They were very famous for their poultry. They did good eggs at the Hollies. He left the Crown and Anchor Hotel to be managed by his son, John Eads Bannister. William Bannister had been up at the Hollies for I think it was about 26 years farming up here. But in 1871 he died at the Hollies, aged 76. It's not clear whether the land sale was made, but a local paper of 1885 informs us that the house, the Hollies, is now the property of John Eads Bannister. He lived there from 1871 with his wife and family until in 1885 he too died. He died of what they described as a painful illness. Whether that was cancer or what it was, we'll never know. Mr. Bannister was a member of the Johnsonville School Committee, and he was on the local board. And the local board was like the local city council, because Johnsonville managed itself in those days. And they were two quite prestigious jobs. So he was well liked, he was a kind man, he was known for his generosity. And when he died, they were going to take his body from the Hollies behind us down to St. John's Church for the funeral. And it was a very big funeral too, from what I can gather. Now, the quickest way of doing that is going straight across Daisy Hill Farm, which was Mr. Bolton's farm. And we can still see Daisy Hill Farm cottage there today. It's halfway up Truscott Avenue on the left. You can sort of see the back of it. It's in lovely order at the moment. But Mr. Bold didn't want the body taken across his land, because there's an old English tradition that says if you carry a dead body across your land, that becomes a public right-of-way, and Mr. Bold didn't want his farm becoming a public right-of-way. So they had to bring the body a mile extra round the long way, which probably didn't go down very well with the people doing it, but you can see Mr. Bold's point. By the way, if you want to know more about Glenside, there's a very good website called glenside.org.nz. The Hollies was occupied by John's eldest daughter, Helen Eleanor Bannister, who lived there with her husband, Llewellyn Smith. They were married in 1877. So around that late 1800s, they were both living there, both Helen and his other daughter, Phoebe Bannister. Phoebe Bannister was married to Mr. Peter Wright Telford, and the Telfords have quite an influence on Wellington too. But sadly, Phoebe died in 1883 at the Hollies. We don't know why. Several months after Mr. Bannister's death, the Hollies was advertised for sale or let. It was described as being in a charming situation with an 8-bedroom dwelling. Remember, before it was actually a 6-bedroom dwelling. Quite often what they just did was add on a couple of bedrooms as the kids arrived. It was on 40 acres of land, 20 of which was in bush, the rest of which was in grass and fenced. It was well watered and well situated. So this is a nice sized property by anyone's stretch of the imagination. It was surrounded in specimen shrubs and trees. It sounds like the property didn't sell because it was being lived in 1906 by John Waters. John Waters was a friend of the family. I think he was married to one of the sisters or something. Family tie up all over the place, and you've got to be very careful with the Bannister family too, because there were about 3 Williams and 2 Johns, and there was another Bannister who was an architect who had nothing to do with them. So it's quite a maze, the Bannister family. It makes the Hollies history quite interesting. Mr. and Mrs. Waters lived at the Hollies until the house burnt down in 1917. Sometime shortly after that, a new cottage was built called Hollies Cottage. It was much smaller, only 4 bedrooms, and it remained there for many, many years and becomes an important part in the next part of our story.
This is the only picture I can find of the original Hollies house. It's the white building in the middle of the screen. To its left is the hay barn, and to the left of that is the milking shed, which was at the top of Hollies Crescent. The church in front of us is the Catholic church on the corner of Moorfield and Broderick Road. This picture is actually readily available to anyone who wants to look at it at the 1841 restaurant in Disraeli Street. It's just behind the door on the left as you go in.
In 1921, the property was purchased by Henry Herbert Knight. The Hollies, behind me, was now reduced to 22 acres, but still a good size for a small dairy farm and poultry. They ran a lot of chickens at the Hollies, well known for it they were. Mr. Knight was a building contractor, so in June 1922 he hired a young Maori man called John Tui. John was 22 years old at that time, to help him run the farm. Mr. Knight was from the UK. He was about 50 years old, fit and healthy person, but deaf. John was paid about £1 a week plus bed and breakfast. The average wage was about £2.50 a week, so he wasn't being overly generous, but he did give him bed and breakfast, so that's something. All was going well until in November 1922, Mr. Knight could not be found by his neighbour, Mr. Layton. Mr. Layton called the police. The police came up and started a search. They talked to John Tui, who said that Mr. Knight had gone away. This was unlikely, as Mr. Knight had a lot of work on and was very busy. On the next visit, John Tui told the constable that Mr. Knight had gone to build a house in Lower Hutt. That was partly true, but he hadn't started building that house and he hadn't got the money to build it yet, so that didn't ring true either. On November the 19th, the police returned and talked to Tui. Tui said, "If I'd hit him over the head and killed him, would I still be here?" A man called Shields was talking to Tui, and Tui said, "They'll never find Mr. Knight. He's gone to Tasmania to visit his brother." Once again, this also wasn't very likely because of all the work that Mr. Knight had on. Tui started selling things from the property. He sold off hens' eggs, he sold the cows, He sold a milk float, which he sold to people from Newtown. The neighbour came along to him and said, "John, stop selling these things. It looks very suspicious. You shouldn't do this." John kept selling off these bits and pieces from the farm, and there was still no sign of Mr. Knight. A few weeks later, a senior detective, Walsh, came up to talk to Toohey. He asked Toohey lots of questions. He asked Toohey, where did Mr. Knight sleep? They went to look to the room where Mr. Knight slept, and there was no bedding. Detective Walsh asked John, where's the bedding? John replied that Mr. Knight had come home drunk one night, set fire to the bedding, and it had all been thrown out. This, unfortunately, didn't altogether ring true either. Mr. Knight wasn't much of a drinker. From what we can read, he didn't hold his drink very well, so it was something he avoided. But no bedding could be found. Later on in the conversation, Toohey admitted that Knight was dead and that he had taken his body and buried it up by the milk shed. But he had not killed him. He was quite adamant he hadn't killed him, he'd just buried the body. On the 5th of November 1922, John Toohey was arrested and charged with the murder of Henry Knight. He pleaded not guilty. One of the motivations for the murder of Mr. Knight could have been that he had a £400 loan to build a cottage out at Lower Hutt. But probably unknown to John Toohey, Mr. Knight hadn't picked up the £400 from the bank, so he didn't have it on the premises when he was murdered. The coroner, a Dr. Hector, explained that Mr. Knight was probably killed in his bed. He was probably struck over the head several times with a large, heavy object that would have killed him. It put a large depression in the skull and caused a lot of bleeding, so Mr. Knight would have undoubtedly died quite quickly after being attacked. John Toohey was found guilty of the murder of Mr. Knight and was sentenced to hang at the Terrace Prison, Wellington, on the 19th of April 1923 at 8 a.m. in the morning. Unsurprisingly, John didn't sleep the night before. He played darts with the wardens. He went to the scaffold in a quiet and calm manner, by which time he had converted to Catholicism. His priest was with him, and he was buried in an unmarked grave in the Catholic part of the Karori Cemetery. Ironically, he wasn't that far away from Mr. Knight. Mr. Knight was at the bottom of Karori Cemetery. But unfortunately, that wasn't rest for Mr. Knight. Mr. Knight got no peace at that time. His skull was discovered to be quite thin, so part of the skull was retained by the New Zealand Police for training purposes. It was good for the recruits to see the difference in thickness between a thin skull and a thick skull, all part of the educational process for a police officer, and quite reasonable too. In 2015, the police reinterred Mr. Knight's skull with the rest of him at Karori Cemetery. I've been up to the Karori Cemetery and it was very hard to find Mr. Knight's burial plot. I did eventually find it. Up until that point, he'd been an unmarked grave, but the police paid for a headstone for him, so he's now at peace in Karori Cemetery. I've been up to Karori Cemetery and I have left flowers for John Toohey, and also I've left special flowers for Mr. Knight. The flowers I got from Mr. Knight would have come from his own backyard. The cottage in which the murder took place was not pulled down, and it stayed in use for many years, and it wasn't until 1979 when it was finally pulled down, a pale shadow of its former glory. Mr. Knight and Mr. Toohey may have gone, but Hollies farm remained. It remained an active and productive farm for many years to come. It wasn't until the late 1950s that a developer bought the sections and turned it into the suburb we know today. Hollies Crescent went in about 1958, and Arapico Street went in, I think it was in 1961. So the story of the Hollies hasn't been forgotten. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, tick like, tick subscribe, leave me some nice comments, hit notifications, more videos coming along very soon. Thank you very much.